Since 1990, only one Democrat has been elected to statewide political office in Wyoming. It's Dave Freudenthal. He left office 12 years ago after 2 terms as governor. In the second of our 2-part interview, Freudenthal talks about how he did it and what he thinks has been lost from Wyoming politics since then. Dave Freudenthal, Part 2. I'm Steve Peck of WyomingPBS, and this is Wyoming Chronicle.
Funding for this program is made possible in part by the Wyoming Humanities Council, helping Wyoming take a closer look at life through the humanities, thinkwy.org, and by the members of the Wyoming PBS Foundation. Thank you for your support.
In researching his new book titled The Paradox of Plenty, former Governor Dave Freudenthal found that history shows states relying heavily on commodity economics follow a typical 3-step progression. And yes, that's exactly what happened since Wyoming instituted a minerals-based severance tax in 1969. Let me read 3 things that you talked about. They're textbook examples, and actually I believe you found a textbook where someone had analyzed them, that characterized what the commodity state is. Mm-hmm. And one is an influx of outside capital to extract and support a resource for processing and sale.
That's us.
Elsewhere. Mm-hmm. We did that. Another one is commodity economies is expanded political and economic influence. So eventually, before long, the political leadership of the state begins to embrace that, protect it, defend it, and govern according to it almost. Mm-hmm. And you could say that
we can certainly say that's the case here.
And then when things begin to go bad, and this is what we're kind of seeing now, the same leadership structure begins to, in a way, try to prevent the commodities economy from responding to what normally in an economic cycle might be just general business conditions, try to erect a barrier to that. And we're seeing some of that now as well, in that we're trying to outlaw a coal plant shutting down, or making it mandatory that it delay it, or prohibiting competition in some way, or there was a bill this year in the legislature to make it penalize you if you tried to buy an electric car, or prevent it even.
Right.
And we've done that. Or that's as you say, we have checked, we can check this box.
We can certainly check that box.
Well, the easiest thing in the world is to say, well, they should have done this. And
I don't know that I'd have done any different.
Yeah, that's the question.
Because, when you go back and you read it, and obviously both you and I knew a lot of these people, they were doing what they thought was right based on the information they had. Part of it was that a lot of those folks were either children of the Depression,
sure,
or their parents had lived through the Depression, and taxes were bad. Yeah. But now we're in a world where to have a livable community, have things, you just got to pay taxes, and you want an education system. They're so much different than they were. So I don't know that the 2 things that in retrospect, which is always 100%, is probably spending more of the money figuring out what's the next economy for Wyoming, and probably limiting the amount of tax relief. Because the other thing that's happened with tax relief is, as you know, nobody got involved with what the school was going to look like, because nobody was asked to do a school bond. It was all come down, use your legislators, use political pressure to get money to build the school. So the local involvement in tax issues, that was lost. But I want to touch on this business about creating barriers.
Okay.
It is such a contradiction for a state who claims to be free enterprise, dedicated Republican.
Let the markets decide.
Let the markets decide. The first time they decide against us, we create every barrier we can, and as you can tell, it's proving to be fruitless. I mean, the problem with markets is that you can maybe incentivize a market, like they did with under George Bush 1, where they created the production tax credit, but you can't really put a lid on it. You can't say to somebody, your coal plant's 50 years old, and it's run its life, and there are cheaper alternatives, but you got to keep the coal plant going. Instead of our thinking about, all right, this is the reality we're dealing with, and there's some realities that are really positive for us. We got a ton of natural gas. We ought to be figuring out, all right, can we get them to convert to natural gas? Or can we get that natural gas moving in a series of pipelines that gets it into the LNG network, as opposed to spending money, suing everybody that is closing down a power plant. You know, the problem is that most of these plants were built about the time I graduated from high school or within the next 10 years. They're old.
We talk about over-dependence on the minerals industry. The minerals industry itself is rather diverse.
It is.
Coal isn't uranium, which isn't oil and gas, which isn't trona by any means, or bentonite. Or now we've got this pilot nuclear plant. We're talking about wind. We talk about rare earth minerals. Is there a place for growth in further diversification or embracing diversification that already sort of exists in the extractive industries?
I think the rare earth minerals thing is really interesting, given the federal incentives that have evolved. I think, you know, it wasn't that we didn't have deposits, it's that they weren't economic. Now that there's more interest in producing in America, I think that's an avenue for us. I think that oil and gas will come back. But another thing is this CO2 storage. I mean, Wyoming should be out through the university mapping the storage capacity for CO2 in this state. We can't make that industry come here, but we can sort of create an information base that encourages. It's kind of like you do at the Oil and Gas Commission, where you got a huge amount of data for the oil companies to look at. And to me, I think that tourism is going to be much more important going forward. We have to figure out a way to keep people here a few more days when they're, you know, going back and forth to the parks. There's some magnificent places in Wyoming, but I suspect a lot of people are like me. I have my favorite fishing place. I really don't want to tell anybody about it.
Yeah. What did you try to do when you were in office? And you were elected in 2002 and served 2 terms. What was your emphasis at the time?
You know, there was a couple of things. I talked earlier about I wanted to revitalize the tourism, which really started under Cliff Hansen, and then
Cliff Hansen, Wyoming governor, later 2-term U.S. senator, 1960s into the Senate.
He kicked it off. Hathaway pushed it, and then we went through a series of government reorganizations, and it kind of fell by the wayside. I wanted to see that done. I wanted to do something about educational infrastructure, K through 12, as well as the community colleges and the university. We spent a lot of money on that, and I think it was it's important because one of the 2 things. One is you want to have an educated workforce if you're going to get businesses. Secondly, you need to figure out a way for our children to have a good life wherever they decide to lead. I wanted to figure out a way to try to preserve some things in the state, and that was the Wildlife Trust Fund. And then we started something called the Business Ready Business Committee program. And then we got it funded, but at a relatively modest level, and it still is now. It's going to take major investments. I will say that I've been disappointed. I mean, we did the science initiative, we did the engineering. I mean, the university, the individual faculty members are pretty amazing. But as an institution, it has not grabbed hold of the idea that part of its service is to help build, through innovation and companies, help build a state. There are some companies that get started, then they move to Colorado.
I saw you at the dedication of the big new science initiative building, one of several incredible pieces of infrastructure that the state essentially paid for. At that time, you said something that stuck with me, and you mentioned it earlier today, and my recollection of it was, we are here today because the future doesn't have a constituency. So what did you mean by that? We're standing in this big building, we've invested in it because we're thinking of today's first grader who one day will get to work in this lab.
That's what you hope,
yeah.
Is that in that building, the university can build the kind of program that will make superstars out of the kids from Wyoming or wherever else that come there, and that those superstars will build not just a better state, but a better world. But the focus in Wyoming tends to be on the here and now, and those things. And Phil Nicholas, who was appropriations chair when I was in, he and I, we had some difficult moments, but we agreed on that we had to figure out a way to set in place things that would make Wyoming the place we dream of it being. We succeeded on some, and I failed on some.
What makes you a Democrat? To a lot of the things you say seem to me to be about the same, or to the average person about the same as what you'd hear mainstream Wyoming Republican.
Yeah.
It seems like, why are you a Dem?
I think because I disavow the extreme rhetoric on both sides of the aisle. It's just absurd. And so I find myself kind of trying to figure out some kind of a moderate, pragmatic approach. And it seemed to me, obviously, when I worked for Herschler, that being a Democrat was more logical. I grew up in a very Republican family, was president of the Teenage Republicans, all of that. But to me, you make the decision in the context you're in. And it was important that you have the freedom not to be obligated to have your ideas formed by some doctrinaire party. And the Democrats were the least doctrinaire of the two parties in Wyoming. And so it was a place where, and as you know, when I ran in 2002, the allegation in the Democratic primary was that I wasn't a real Democrat.
A dino.
Yeah, a dino, I guess. But in the end, I am who I am. I'm not particularly comfortable, I'm not comfortable at all with the language on the two spectrums of the party.
You're not Bernie Sanders or...
no. Bernie Sanders, or the former Speaker of the House, I can get along without her. I mean, but on the other hand, I'm not Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, and I think most people want to figure out, how do we pragmatically make this a better place for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, and have some hope for the future. And I don't know that the extremes of either party are focused on it. They're busy with outrage and demonizing and all the rest of it. If you think about it, that was part of the gift that Hathaway had when he was governor. He became a little more acerbic in his later years. And Herschler, I mean, there was a kind of, I don't agree with you, but we'll fight about it and maybe we'll go have a drink. Whereas now, we're just going to fight about it. And I don't like you.
And we're not going to go have a drink.
Yeah, well, that's right.
How did you first come to know Ed Herschler?
By accident. I had got my undergraduate degree at Amherst College. And one of my economics professors, a guy named Chalmers, had married a girl from Thermopolis. He had gone to the University of Wyoming, knew some of the people who were in Herschler's transition team. But he was also, I had come back from Amherst and was the staff economist at DPAD under Don Brunk.
I see.
And so I was supervising these contracts about population projections and all that. Chalmers was doing those. So then Chalmers gets asked by some of the people on Herschler's transition team for some names of some bright young people to interview. So I go in, I got lucky, interviewed with Herschler, hadn't met him, didn't know him from a bucket of bolts, and he hired me. And the end of that particular story is that after a few years of working for him and I got to know him, I said, so why did you hire me? And he said, well, because I came in with my Amherst economics degree. I mean, big time. He said, well, I thought you were kind of a smart blank. And frankly, wasn't that impressed. He said, you've been Boy State governor. And he was big in American Legion, Boy State.
I was in Boy State.
Yeah.
He came to speak to us that day. I remember asking him a question at the press conference we had.
And he said, so I figured anybody who'd been Boy State governor deserved a second chance. And that's how I got hired.
Well, lots of higher level elected officials count on smart young people with energy to do a lot of work for them, don't they? I'm sure you did as well. What did you do for him as time went by over his 3 terms? Now, you weren't there part of the administration that whole time, but
I'd come back to work to pay off my college debt so I'd go to law school. So then I'm working for Herschler, and it was an exciting time. We did the Industrial Siting Act, we did land use planning, big mineral boom, and so I did everything from frankly, write speeches, write policy papers. I'd send him these really learned memos And he'd call me in, and he'd look at me and he said, "So, what makes you think that's such a good idea?" I mean, it was a fairly candid. And then in '77, he said, "Well, you need to get to law school, and if you go to law school and you get on law review your first semester, you can come back to work." So I did. So then I went back to work, and I did the campaign in '78 and '82. Was part of that sort of kitchen cabinet. And then when Herschler went out of office, he came and practiced law with us.
Ed Herschler had been a legislator. I think what people might forget is that he ran for Congress.
Yeah, he did.
And was defeated. And bounced back from that to build this, I'd say it's not an exaggeration to say, a legendary career in Wyoming, the only governor ever to serve 3 terms, and was a Democrat. And it was succeeded by another Democrat who served 2 more terms. Then there was 2 terms under Republican Governor Geringer. Then you come along. The red shell around Wyoming was pretty well established then. We weren't a majority Democratic state, and I don't know if we ever were, when that might have been. It certainly wasn't true in Ed Herschler's time.
No, it wasn't even true in the 40s.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there's been one presidential election once in 80 years, 90 years, has the Democrat carried Wyoming. Yeah. That's now been 60 years ago. So, and yet here you came again. When Governor Sullivan retired and tried to he ran for the Senate, I remember thinking, if Mike Sullivan, a well-regarded, pragmatic, 2-term governor, just leaving office with solid approval, couldn't get elected to the U.S. Senate, then we'll never see another Democrat elected on a statewide ballot again. 8 years later, here you come. How'd you do that? I've come to think that you particularly were an outlier as an individual, maybe more so than you were still at a time when Wyoming was considering someone with a D after his name. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think they like my wife and kids.
It's important, isn't it?
It is, yeah. But I think more than anything, I wasn't particularly strident about any of it. I just sort of thought we ought to do things different. And let me say that when Nancy and I decided to run, we didn't exactly hire a moving van in anticipation of moving. But I had some thoughts about how I thought we ought to do some things and do some things differently. And I wanted to have my say.
Very close election against a highly qualified candidate that would seem to have checked every single box.
I mean, I just happened to catch it when people were interested in being pragmatic. That's the item that I think has evaporated from politics. It's now Facebook clips, saying outrageous stuff. Can I get in the media? I mean, there's some pretty decent, just sort of substantive bills going through. They get no attention. And both parties have become remarkably committed to social engineering my private life. And I don't think it's any of their business, one way or the other. And that used to be the attitude in Wyoming. As you know, growing up here, it was fundamentally live and let live. You know, I'm not going to violate your space and you stay out of mine and we can be friends.
Yeah, I remember my father saying he really didn't know what some friend or business associate's politics were. Didn't know. It didn't come up and he didn't care. Didn't want to know. Yeah. Maybe better not to know sometimes.
Well, and people made judgments about other people without labels.
Yeah.
I mean, you either earned the respect or the disrespect based on what you did, not on some preconceived label. It's created a really kind of timid atmosphere for people who are thinking about stuff. So they don't want to risk taking a big initiative unless they can figure out, how do I turn it into a Facebook thing or whatever it is. I don't do Facebook, but it seems to be what everybody's obsessed with. And I think we have lost the key ingredient of Wyoming, which was our advantages were small. And if we can figure out what we want to do, we can move quickly, which most states can't. And we should be taking advantage of it. there are a lot of things you do, but it's incremental. And it's like baseball. Once in a while you get a home run, but most of the time you win with base hits.
You can't plan for the 3-run homer in the bottom of the ninth. Great when you get it.
Yeah,
but that
that's
can't
right.
be.
It's a gift when it comes, but don't count on
the
it.
way to do it. You couldn't have been elected without a lot of Republicans voting for you. Your second term, a lot of Republicans must have voted for you. You won by a big margin. What do you think about this legislation to keep Democrats from voting in the Republican primary, or vice versa? Because sometimes that happens too.
It's a symbolic fight over the last war. I mean, if every Democrat in the state had voted for Liz Cheney, it wasn't going to change the outcome. Yeah. But it gave people a chance to be outraged. It's sort of like election fraud. I mean, county clerks are really serious about what they do, and they're really good at it, you know. And so the notion that they were tolerating fraud, I mean, you've taken the sort of bombastic national issue, you bring it to Wyoming. It has no application in Wyoming. I mean, it's like all of the anger about we can't have drop boxes. Well, 2 weeks ago, Trump came out and said, yeah, we should have drop boxes. And you look at it and you think, couldn't we spend that same amount of time and energy figuring out how to make this a better place, as opposed to figuring out how to beat up on people about stuff that, frankly, it doesn't improve things.
And when you were governor, the capital renovation initiative was being talked about then. That took a long time, a huge expense, and it's mostly finished now. We're in the Capitol. There were years when the legislature couldn't even meet here while it was being done. This is a historic room. Do you know much about it?
Well, what I do know is it was once the seat of the Wyoming Supreme Court. And in fairness, I have to say that I vetoed the first proposal.
You did?
I did. It was they buried it in the appropriations bill. And the idea of spending $600-700 million, and we're still not done, didn't seem to me to be the most important thing in the state. So there's parts of this that are absolutely beautiful. On the other hand, if you've tried to find your way around the Hearstler building, that's a trick in itself. And you may want to leave cookie crumbs if you're going to find your way out. And I think the other thing that has been lost is that sort of, used to be people could visit Cheyenne, and 4 of the elected officials were on the same floor, and you could walk into their office. And they did it all the time. It was great fun.
So you're saying when you were governor, as recently as then, it wasn't impossible to just walk in unannounced and get 10 minutes of the governor's time?
No. I mean, and as governor, it was just a hoot. I mean, people are so interesting. But yeah, and then you could walk down the hall and walk across the hall, and there's the treasurer, and down the hall, there's the auditor, and then the Secretary of State. And it was very much the same. And to me, what we've lost in this building is 2 things: the communications between the elected officials, because they need to learn to get along, which isn't always easy, and the user-friendly nature of government. It's become very, and we had security, and she had a panic button, and once in a while they had to use it.
And I'm not saying that no one could do that with Governor Gordon now, but I'm interested to hear you talk about what your experience was.
Yeah. Well, now look at the physical structure he's behind. You know, you got big policemen sitting out there, you got the glass doors. I mean, it's not Gordon, it's the edifice. I mean, I do think that part of that distance is a part of the reason that people can vilify each other. It's hard to vilify somebody you know.
How has the governor's relationship with the legislature changed? Was the governor a more powerful office when you had it, do you think?
The governor makes that decision. And that I learned from watching Hathaway and Hearstler. They firmly believed that the job of the chief executive was to set the agenda. Now, do you get it all what you want? No. You know, but you learn that when you're about 18 months old. You don't get everything you want. But it becomes the basis around which the debate is formed. So, I mean, every year I followed the same pattern that those two had. You had a set of things you wanted passed, and certain things you wanted done. You highlighted some of them, and then you had the little attachment to your message about this bill needs to be done, this bill needs to be done.
Sure.
And you didn't ever leave, you didn't ever fail to fulfill your responsibilities as a co-equal branch of government. And the legislature didn't fail to fulfill theirs. I mean, I remember being up in front of the Appropriations Committee for 8 hours. And, you know, they wanted to ask questions, and I thought I had answers. And it was everything from soup to nuts. And they were all, you know, as Al Simpson would say, they were of the other faith. And you know, I described it as 8 hours of stump the governor. They didn't get it done, and from then on we got along great. But the individual who holds the office, what you really have is the bully pulpit. The opportunity to try to advance what you believe is important to the state. You have to accept that you're going to win some, you're going to lose some, but at the end of the day, you hope that the state's a better place than when you started, and that doesn't happen if you're passive.
And for someone who wants to know a lot about the mechanics of a really, really interesting and, as we're learning now, important part of Wyoming, this is a great place to start. So I thank you for this and very much appreciate you being with us today on Wyoming Chronicle. Governor Dave Freudenthal.
I enjoyed it.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
Funding for this program is made possible in part by the Wyoming Humanities Council, helping Wyoming take a closer look at life through the humanities, thinkwhy.org, and by the members of the Wyoming PBS Foundation. Thank you for your support.